Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good morning, everybody. My name is Reem El Qureshi from the Financial Academy. I would like to invite you to our event today. This event is sponsored by the Financial Academy in coordination with our delivery partner, the Global Infrastructural Hub. Financial Academy is the tool of the FSDP, which is the Financial Sector Development Program, which is pertaining to the Saudi Vision 2030 for the development of the economical development of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The role of Financial Academy is to provide high-level specialized services and help develop the finance sector by providing trainings, exams, and certificates, and the tools for the professionals to advance in their skills and create a pipeline of experts and promoting innovation in the field of financial sector. Our visitor today is Mr. Sam Barr. He is the Director of Knowledge Mobilization in Global Infrastructural Hub, which is itself an initiative of G20. Mr. Sam is an economics, public policy, and a governmental professional for nearly 15 years of experience in both the public and the private sector. He will be presenting a very interesting topic today, which is infrastructural monitoring, innovative funding, and finance. We'll be introducing you in a short while. Before this, I just want to remind you that we are going to leave the chat open, and you can give any questions whatsoever if you have for Mr. Sam, and at the end of the event, we will be answering those. And there's going to be a code which will appear for satisfaction. We look forward from hearing from you. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Mr. Sam. Please take the stage.
Thank you, Reem. Well, good morning. My name is Sam Barr, Director of Knowledge Mobilization at the Global Infrastructure Hub. What this means is I develop and deliver the GI Hub's capacity building programs globally. I want to begin by thanking the Financial Academy for asking me to speak today. Infrastructure isn't always front and centre as a topic for those in the finance industry, but I do hope that some of the data that we run through today will demonstrate some of infrastructure's unique strengths as an asset class. And also, thank you to those in the audience for your time. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. Today, we will begin with an introduction to the G20 group of countries and an introduction to the work of the Global Infrastructure Hub. I'll follow this with some data-driven insights about the state of the infrastructure sector derived from our 2022 Infrastructure Monitor report, as well as two other GI Hub products, InfraCompass and InfraTracker. And finally, we will talk about innovative funding and financing in the sector with a focus on a local innovation, the Green Sukuk. I hope you will enjoy, and feel free, as Reem said, to comment as we go, and I certainly hope we have some time at the end to take some questions. So let's begin by talking about the G20 and the Global Infrastructure Hub. The Group of 20 countries is an economic forum of most of the world's largest economies. It brings together the leaders and finance ministers of these countries to discuss major issues affecting the world economy. It tends to focus on issues like financial stability, climate change mitigation and resilience, and sustainable lending and development. It also has a working group dedicated to global issues in the infrastructure sector. The G20 was founded in 1999 and has become one of the preeminent global forums for economic matters. The presidency of the G20 rotates on an annual basis, with India being the current president. Indonesia was the most recent past president, and Brazil will take over the presidency from 2024. Saudi Arabia held the presidency for the first time in 2020, and during that time supported a unique agenda for infrastructure, focusing on ways to increase the uptake of technology and innovation in the sector, which has traditionally struggled to match the pace of innovation in other industries. It was also the first presidency of the COVID era, with meetings required to be held almost exclusively virtually for the first time, a challenge which the Saudi government navigated very successfully. The Global Infrastructure Hub was created by the G20 in 2014 and commenced operations in 2015. We are headquartered in Sydney, Australia, but also have an office in Toronto, Canada. As well as that, we have staff stationed in a variety of other locations around the world. The GI Hub is unique as the only full-time staffed organisation associated with the G20. There is no other similar entity that the G20 has created, and it has no full-time secretariat. Our role is to support the G20 and its members to drive an ambitious agenda on infrastructure that is sustainable, infrastructure that is resilient, and infrastructure that is inclusive. We have a global mandate that is aligned with G20 priorities. What this means in practice is that while we are guided by the G20 and its countries, our projects and programs deliver for all countries and jurisdictions, G20 or otherwise. Partnerships and collaboration are at the heart of what we do. We are particularly focused on bringing together the public and private sectors to enhance cooperation and mutual understanding. This is particularly important in the infrastructure sector compared to most other sectors, as the public sector is typically the client and the private sector the provider to the public sector. So government to business relations are paramount. We deliver value for the infrastructure community and beyond in three ways. Firstly, we develop data-driven insights. Our data and economics team use a variety of sources to create relevant and usable insights for infrastructure professionals and decision makers. A lot of our work in this regard focuses especially on the financial performance of infrastructure as an asset class. Second, we advocate for reform in the sector, particularly where there are regulatory, legislative, or policy impediments to better infrastructure outcomes. This ranges from everything to advocating for policies to support the uptake of more infratech, all the way to working with banking regulatory capital requirements for infrastructure investments. And thirdly, we develop pragmatic solutions and guidance to help practitioners mainstream best practice in their day-to-day work. We play a unique role in the infrastructure ecosystem, and we're uniquely positioned to collaboratively address information gaps, barriers, and opportunities by acting as a global knowledge and data hub, enhancing capabilities and connections, and reducing economic and legal barriers. Through collaboration, we ensure our work adds to, rather than duplicates, the work of others in the global community. I want to move on now to some emerging trends in infrastructure investment. Infrastructure Monitor 2022 is the third edition of our flagship report on the state of investment in infrastructure. It provides in-depth analysis of global private investment in infrastructure projects, and it examines infrastructure investment performance. The 2022 edition also introduces reporting on the availability of private capital for infrastructure investment raised through infrastructure funds, as well as the role of multilateral development banks, or MDBs, in private investment in infrastructure and providing blended finance. After remaining resilient overall through the initial shock of the pandemic in 2020, private investment in infrastructure projects in primary markets recovered in 2021 to just 0.3% below its 2019 level. This recovery was largely the result of growth in the regions hardest hit during the pandemic, Oceania, Latin America, and Asia, which all saw investment bounce back following steep regional declines in 2020. However, the longer-term story of private investment in infrastructure is actually one of stagnation. Private investment in infrastructure projects in primary markets has been stagnant for 8 years running, and the USD 172 billion invested in infrastructure by private investors in 2021 remains far shy of what is needed to close the infrastructure investment gap globally. Investment trends also differ among high, middle, and low-income countries, and the level of investment in middle and low-income countries actually continues to decline. In 2021, financial services institutions, primarily commercial and investment banks, continued to play a leading role in financing private investment in infrastructure projects. Their role has grown in prominence over time, including in 2021, with bank share of financing increasing from 53% in 2011 to 67% 10 years later in 2021. Developers have the second largest share at 6.5%, mostly in the form of equity, followed closely by MDBs and other development banks. Over time, public sector funding of private investment in infrastructure projects has been falling. It continued to fall in 2021. The public sector share fell from 19% in 2011 to just 4% in 2021. The shift away from public infrastructure financing towards private was prominent at the start of the decade, mostly in India, the biggest public financier of private investment in infrastructure projects over that period. Facing fiscal constraints and high government debt, India made efforts to improve its regulatory environment to encourage PPPs and attract greater private financing for its growing infrastructure needs. Thus, India reduced its participation in total public financing of private investment in infrastructure projects from a significant 64% in 2011 down to the global average of 4% in 2021, an enormous shift. During the last decade, the US and Australia, also important public financiers of private investment in infrastructure projects, also reduced their participation. Direct financing of private investment in infrastructure projects by insurance companies and pension funds remains surprisingly low at 1%. However, such entities participate indirectly through unlisted funds and capital markets and directly in secondary markets, which are very important in particular for pension funds. In the secondary market, private investment in infrastructure has emerged largely unaffected by the global pandemic, growing for a second consecutive year in 2021. Indeed, private investment in infrastructure accelerated significantly in 2021, rising by 37% to USD 632 billion in over 1,000 transactions, the strongest result since data collection began. Private investment in infrastructure in secondary markets has almost quintupled since 2010, reflecting the growth of infrastructure as an asset class and the increasing trend towards active portfolio management in all private markets. Considering the long holding periods of infrastructure assets, the secondary market is well suited as a mechanism for servicing investor needs and preferences changing over time. The 2021 increase was driven mainly by strong growth in acquisitions, particularly in telecommunications and in energy transmission and distribution, which more than doubled following 2 years of decline. This is likely to reflect several factors, including the increasing attraction of investors towards safe haven of secondary markets. What this means is it's where investors perceive mature markets as having lower risk than greenfield transactions amid heightened global uncertainty. Pent-up demand following pandemic restrictions in 2020, which constrained site inspections and due diligence for many infrastructure investors. And the potential hedge that infrastructure assets can offer against rising inflation, concerns about which began intensifying in 2021 and beyond and will continue in our mind for some time yet. In 2021, refinancing accounted for USD 221 billion. The largest component, 35% of secondary investment in infrastructure, as investors continued to take advantage of what at that stage were low interest rates. However, this trend may change as interest rates rose in the first half of the year and are expected to continue to rise in the second half to deal with continuing high inflation. Infrastructure as an asset class continues to provide a wide range of attractive investment options. Over a 10-year period, returns on infrastructure debt were higher than returns on 10-year government bonds in developed markets at a slightly higher risk. Listed infrastructure equities in developed markets provided returns comparable to listed global equity returns, but at a lower risk. Unlisted infrastructure equities provided significantly higher returns at a lower risk than listed global equities, which is why the popularity of unlisted infrastructure equities among investors has increased over time. In emerging markets, unlisted infrastructure equities are attractive as they provide higher returns than listed global equities at roughly the same level of risk, while in developed markets, they provide higher returns than listed global equities at a lower risk. According to Preqin, including infrastructure assets in the portfolio mix helps reduce portfolio risk without sacrificing returns. But moving up the risk spectrum, the impact of adding infrastructure assets becomes smaller. For low-risk portfolios, it could be efficient to allocate up to 30% of the portfolio to infrastructure, but this weight would decline as risk appetite increases. Also, infrastructure assets are an attractive investment option for long horizon portfolios on account of their low correlation with other investment options and their consistent returns. And this is probably what drives the interest of pension funds dealing with these in their portfolios. Overall, what we might be seeing in this sector is a flight to quality in terms of investments, particularly if macroeconomic conditions deteriorate further. We have already seen investors show a much stronger preference for brownfields infrastructure over greenfields projects. Brownfields projects are established infrastructure projects with established revenues and at a much lower risk, whereas greenfield projects are those that are at the pre-build stage. The construction phase of an infrastructure project is where the highest proportion of risk is assumed by the project proponent. This preference on the part of investors is understandable, but it can create financing issues for governments, as they will often be looking to create new infrastructure. This leads to a mismatch between investors and governments. This mismatch can, however, be managed by innovative funding and financing techniques, in particular asset recycling, where a brownfields asset is sold onto the market and the funds achieved through that sale are then reinvested in greenfields projects. We are also seeing some signs that investors may be focusing more on developed economies, again, as a move towards risk mitigation. Perceived sovereign risk is one of the most commonly cited issues by potential investors when assessing whether or not to invest in infrastructure in any given jurisdiction. The Infra Tracker is the first annual tracker of public investment in infrastructure for the G20. It helps governments shape programs and budgets that achieve the best outcomes by allowing them to research and compare approaches to infrastructure spending and the outcomes being targeted by other governments within the G20. Infrastructure represents annual estimates of G20's planned investment in infrastructure and the transformative outcomes that can be achieved through this investment to improve sustainability, inclusivity, and resilience while enhancing economic development. Drawing primarily from central government budgets, InfraTracker presents 2022 estimates of G20 central government's investments in infrastructure and G20 central government's transfers to other levels of governments for investment in infrastructure. These estimates can be filtered and viewed in various combinations, including by country, by infrastructure sector and subsector, and also by the targeted outcome. And you can see an example of that on your screen now. By aggregating the latest budgeted government investment in infrastructure, the Infratracker illuminates how governments are responding to recent market conditions and how infrastructure investment is being used to tackle international and national challenges like climate change and social inequality. You can see here that transport and social infrastructure are among the key pillars of Saudi infrastructure investment in the coming years. And what you can see here in this graph is that the main priorities for the Saudi government are the main priorities as stated by the Saudi government in public government strategy and policy documents. As you can see, along with a very strong focus on job creation and economic growth, Saudi strategy documents are focused on inclusivity outcomes, including affordability, access to services and inclusive mobility, and resilience, including social cohesion, disaster and climate adaptation. InfraCompass, which again you can see on your screen now, is a tool for infrastructure policymakers. It objectively quantifies the strength of the infrastructure enabling environment of a given country by aggregating data for 81 countries, collectively representing 93% of global GDP and 86% of the world's population. It aims to help governments and policy specialists assess where a country is performing well and where there are opportunities for improvement, allowing them to identify policies that will lead to better public and private infrastructure investment and a better infrastructure investing environment by aggregating this data. InfraCompass assesses countries' infrastructure enabling environment across 8 drivers: governance, regulatory frameworks, permits, planning, procurement, activity, funding capacity, and financial markets. Saudi Arabia is a very strong performer as a global leader in both planning and procurement and a top performer in permits. Given the role that sovereign risk plays in investment decisions, we estimate that Saudi Arabia will continue to be a very, very strong performer across these metrics well into the future and a very attractive investment environment. In 2021, in response to a request from G20 countries and the global necessity to find better ways to fund and finance projects, the GI Hub released the innovative funding and financing tool. The starting point of the tool was, how can we capture more of investors' attention? They're very simple. The project, as we then developed it, does this in 3 ways. Firstly, it allows proponents to navigate regulatory, political, and economic uncertainty. Infrastructure development is often incredibly complex, and alignment is needed across multiple, diverse, and in many cases, or some cases, competing stakeholder groups. It creates, the tool allows users the opportunity to create the proper regulatory environment and an economically robust environment. Second, it helps users to develop projects with attractive risk-weighted return profiles, the importance of which we saw earlier in this presentation. This ensures that projects deliver the revenues needed to fund them, and it's based on 2 key principles: value creation, including strong revenue potential, and value capture, where we ensure that key risks are mitigated and that projects are financed to secure profitability for the long run. It also, and this is very important, supports the availability of programmatic pipelines, which is a huge benefit for those looking to invest in any given jurisdiction. It allows this by developing a clear vision for infrastructure development agenda and its goals. And clarity in this enables a robust and properly prioritized pipeline of projects. So why does innovative funding and financing matter? Fundamentally, the private sector simply must play a strong role in infrastructure's future financing. I'll give some reasons for that here. Recently, the world for the first time hit 100% of global public debt, as in it now equals global GDP. And this is a figure that's likely to have since grown. in the same time between the first half of 2019 and the first half of 2020, there was a 56% drop in private investment in infrastructure. Obviously, that was impacted by COVID and there has been some bounce back, but there is still a long way to go. And possibly most alarmingly, and where the need is greatest, is that an additional 0.55% of global GDP is needed in addition to what is currently being spent on infrastructure globally out to 2030 to close the infrastructure funding gap worldwide. The GI Hub funding and financing tool has two elements, which I will run through today. The first is the framework itself, which outlines a series of potential options for policymakers to better fund projects, to better finance projects, to provide more revenue from projects, and to de-risk projects. It also contains the case study library, which gives dozens of examples of how these options have been implemented. It is a digital tool and it is available online now. And most importantly, it is designed for simplicity. You don't have to be a finance expert. You don't have to be a legal expert. You do not have to be an infrastructure expert to be able to use and gain a significant amount of value from the funding and financing tool. A key part of the tool is its dedicated case study library. It contains on financial innovations for infrastructure delivery. Again, this is available online and contains well over 100 case studies from a range of different funding, financing, and de-risking levers on every continent around the world. This is important because one thing that we've noticed here at the GI Hub is that everyone wants to innovate, but nobody wants to innovate first. Case studies then provide decision makers in the sector with real-life examples of when an innovative funding, financing, or de-risking tool has been successfully applied. This can make for a much more compelling story when advocating for new ways of doing things. I want to focus now on a case study, and as I said at the top of the seminar, it's a local case study from Saudi Arabia. No doubt there will be those of you in the audience who are much more familiar with both this particular case study and the financial instrument that I'm speaking to, which is the Green Sukuk. But I wanted to outline it because I wanted to demonstrate that there are innovative ways of funding and financing in the sector being used all around the world. And I thought it would be good to showcase one in the Saudi context. Saudi Arabia, as we know, and the Vision 2030 is a big part of managing this, but there's a significant reliance on fossil fuels for power generation, and also a high level of energy usage per capita because of the reliance on air conditioning and desalinated water. Now, there's immense investment needs to finance sustainable development of new forms of generation. Now, as the government of Saudi Arabia aims to rapidly diversify away from oil, there was an increased focus on sustainable strategies and growth of Islamic capital markets. Issuers were looking for ways to either diversify their investor base or to gain a pricing benefit by adopting sustainable practices. The Green Sukuk market was an emerging product then in the region. The first Green Sukuk in Saudi Arabia was issued by the Saudi Electric Company back in 2020. It was the first public Green Sukuk in international markets. This was supported by clear, sustainable finance guidelines and regulations. The financial instrument followed an ijara structure. Proceeds of the purchase were used by the issuer to buy electricity distribution assets from the SEC. The SEC then pays a certain amount on a semi-annual basis to lease the assets from the issuer. These rents are transferred to certificate holders in a periodic distribution. Now, the outcome of this is that over USD 1.3 billion green certificates were issued, split into two tranches. The Sukuk was made up of USD 650 million green certificates maturing in 2025, with the other USD 650 million maturing 5 years later in 2030. The certificates have been admitted to trade on the Euronext Dublin. Proceeds from the Sukuk were used to finance or refinance green projects focused on procurement and installation of smart meters, as well as construction and operation of infrastructure for connecting renewable energy sources to the grid. The green Sukuk issuance generated high interest and oversubscribed 4 times over, attracting a combination of over 267 institutional investors and dedicated green accounts spanning 22 countries from Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. I think that would be considered a roaring success by anyone's standards. In terms of some of the key lessons learned, as we understand them, in the governance realm, a third-party auditor was commissioned to perform an external verification of the environmental and social benefits or impacts of the Sukuks to verify if the outcomes of the underlying projects have actually been achieved. From a financial aspect, Islamic finance shared the common goal of sustainable investing to deliver social impacts with the Green Sukuk. So leveraging untapped Islamic financial capital and innovative green finance thus became an alternative to close the financing gap for climate actions and also to accelerate progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And another issue related to governance, the government-related issuer, SEC in this case, benefited from credit linkages with the government. So the issuer rating of A2 by Moody's at the time reflected the creditworthiness of SEC, where it achieved a very high level of dependence and high level support from the government. So no doubt most of the people in the room understand what a Sukuk is, but to briefly recap, it's an Islamic bond compliant with Islamic finance principles prohibiting the charging of interest, which involves ownership and risk sharing between issuers and investors. Now, green Sukuks are directed towards projects aimed at mitigating impacts of climate change and promoting environmental sustainability through projects such as renewable energy projects, green buildings, sustainable transport, and waste management. Other similar Sukuks involving similar themes involve social Sukuks, sustainability Sukuks, SDG-linked, transition, and blue. Some of the benefits include that governments can diversify their sources of funding, grow their investor base in international markets, and advance their sustainability commitments. Investors, by their turn, engage for multiple reasons. The requirements of Islamic finance and ESG investing complement each other as social and moral value-aligned investment approaches. It fulfills substantial funding requirements for sustainable development activities and projects in developing countries. Also, the instrument has characteristics of sustainability and stability by its very nature, due to avoidance of speculative and toxic instruments based on derivatives, generally full collateralization, and very close links with the real economy. You can see here the rapid growth in green Sukuks since they were introduced back in 2019 or 2020. Nearly $6 billion worth of projects have been undertaken using this innovative model, with issuers including the Saudi Electric Company, as we previously heard, the Saudi National Bank, Riyadh Bank, and Al Rajhi Bank. Now, to close out, in an uncertain world with an even more uncertain economic outlook, 2 things stand as markers for success in infrastructure finance. Firstly, good fundamentals at the national level. An infrastructure enabling environment that supports and attracts investment is a necessary precondition of success. And Saudi Arabia is very lucky in that regard through the hard work that they've done to support this. Secondly, a will to innovate will also help drive further success and growth in the sector. And once again, I think we've seen through the advent of the green Sukuk that Saudi is also very well placed in that regard. And the Vision 2030 program is also something that supports similar levels of innovation and diversification across the sector. With that, I will leave you. We may have some questions, but I wanted to thank all of you in the audience for your time once again, and thank you so much to the Financial Academy for asking me to speak here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sam, for such an interesting questions and content that you delivered. I have received a couple of questions. One of the questions that's been asked is that if there is one thing that you could advise on innovative techniques for funding, which has shown results in the past, what would that be for developing countries?
So I would say for developing countries in particular, there's often a focus on the de-risking of projects. And it is important to de-risk projects where you can for investors. And an example of that, for instance, would be the use of blended finance with a multilateral development bank, where a multilateral development bank provides a significant part of the debt and will typically take it on as junior debt, meaning they're not necessarily paid first in the event of default. And then private investors provide additional finance because of that de-risking process, and will then, provide potentially some of the senior debt, which would get paid first in the advent of a default, in the event of a default, rather. And that is important, that project level de-risking. But what I actually think is more important in the context of developing countries is de-risking at the sovereign level. And what I mean by that is undertaking work that provides a better and more attractive enabling environment for infrastructure investors. And what that means is things like the ability to enforce property rights, the ability to withdraw funding and capital from a market, all of these things which provide investors comfort that they're going to be fairly treated with regards to their investment. And that, for me, it's an absolute necessary precondition for getting more private investment in markets like this. And it goes even beyond that sovereign risk level. One way, I'll use an example of Rwanda, who recently, in the last 5 to 10 years, very much they automated and digitized their system for transferring land permit ownership. And what that actually did, it sounds like quite a small thing, but it had a massive impact on private investment, because one of the biggest costs often that private investors face, particularly in developing countries, is the holding cost of holding land whilst not being able to build on it due to regulatory imposts. And if you can cut back those regulatory imposts, often with the stroke of a pen at the regulatory level, or by relatively inexpensive interventions like the digitization of services, you actually then attract a significant amount of more private investment, because you're significantly lowering one of the main cost drivers for private investors. So I would say that probably the fundamentals around creating a strong enabling environment are definitely the most important thing for developing countries in particular.
Great, thank you very much. Another question is about the green financing. What are your advices for developing countries again?
Well, it's an interesting one in terms of green financing, and using the definition here of green financing as any sort of financing which can be applied to a project that has significant sort of environmental and sustainability goals. One of the criticisms that you occasionally get of green financing, particularly in developing countries, is that the more ESG sort of requirements that a project has put on it in developing countries, it's loading costs onto the project sometimes. If you're forcing the project to jump through a lot of environmental and regulatory hoops. And so what that means is there's been some criticism in the past that then makes projects uneconomical and unaffordable. But there's an element of a catch-22 with that argument, because increasingly, because of the nature of the social license of a lot of investors, both at the public level, there's a public expectation that long-term investors particularly will invest in greener projects and move away from things like extractives, for instance. That's not completely widespread, but it's certainly a growing view. And then it's also happening at the shareholder level too. So you're also seeing shareholder pressure get put on a lot of investment firms to increasingly invest in green projects. And so, whilst there may be a cost associated with some levels of providing more green outcomes from projects, you almost need to fulfill those environmental requirements to attract private finance, simply because a lot of organisations and a lot of institutions simply won't invest in projects anymore that don't fulfil a lot of these environmental requirements. And I mean, we've heard of banks from a range of jurisdictions saying that they'll be essentially completely out of investing in carbon intensive industries by 2030 or 40 or 50. Right. It will simply be impossible to finance a lot of these things otherwise. So the other thing is you need to sort of take a life cycle approach as well. Whilst upfront costs might be higher, you may actually see a lot of cost savings down the line. An example of that would be green generation of electricity through, say, solar or hydro. So yeah, that is the point I would make.
Okay, sounds good, because my next question is exactly according to that, about sustainable financing and ESG. This is something very important for every country to move on. What are your opinions about that?
Well, I mean, look, that's a really broad question, but I think the fundamental point is governments are now, almost all G20 countries, I would say, have some level of significant, if not a net zero, then a significant carbon emission reduction target, most by 2050, some out to 2060, but there's very few developing countries now, and G20 countries, the larger countries in particular, have largely signed up to something like this.
Right.
And if you look at a graph of how close countries are to actually achieving the emissions that they're proposing to achieve, it's going to have to go from something very flat at the moment in terms of reductions to absolutely skyrocket. And that is going to have to be achieved through, I think, a blend of it's going to be difficult. There's going to have to be massive levels of investment, public investment, I think, to achieve that. But also there's going to have to be a significant involvement from the private sector to support governments in that. And we're actually at a funny stage in the infrastructure sector particularly, and I sort of alluded to this before, where you've actually got a lot of private investors in particular, but also constructors and other people within the industry who are actually a long way ahead of the regulatory curve. So, and what I mean by that is typically, you have to drag companies kicking and screaming to kind of, undertake their obligations in whatever sort of regulatory area it might be for highly regulated industries. But because of the pressure that's coming from external sources, as I said, whether it's shareholders, boards, the public, companies are actually getting ahead of governments in terms of how hard they push themselves on this, which is quite an extraordinary inversion from normal business. So, look, I think it's going to take an enormous effort from both sides of the equation, I think, is how I would put it. So both government and the private sector will have to be hugely involved and working, if not hand in hand, and very closely together to achieve some of those net zero targets.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much. I have a lot of questions, but I didn't think so we can finish all of them in this program. But thank you very much on the behalf of Financial Academy for taking time to educate us and increase our awareness about the innovative financing. Thank you very much.
Pleasure, Reem. Thank you. And once again, thank you all to the attendees.
All right. Thank you.